Seattle on the northwest coast of the United States, and I'm on my way to a major exhibition. But to be honest with you, it's incredible that it's going ahead at all, because what's being exhibited has had to endure years of attention, from insects and rats, looters and Bedouin treasure hunters, and over-eager academics armed with sticky tape and glue. This is what I've come 5,000 miles to see. What's in these cabinets has been fought and argued over for 60 years. They've been described as the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. But along with the acclaim comes controversy. The scrolls have been dogged by accusations of conspiracy and cover-up, and rumors that they may contain secrets about the origins of Christianity. As the 60th anniversary of their discovery approaches, it's time for a reappraisal. Like most people, I've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but don't know what they actually contain. This is what's got me interested. Uncovering the story of the scrolls is going to take me around the world.
Now, this was the first time the scrolls were ever found. It's where the whole story started.
Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls might have been written or copied in this room.
God is coming. Judgment is coming. Now the axe is laid to the root of the tree. We have a story that is not just pure legend in there.
The scandal erupted, and the church realized that they had to control the information. You know, it's just not a pretty picture.
Looks like burned bits of toast.
Watch this. Presto change.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Big issues of history turn on the proper interpretation of a single letter. And you can say, that's the letter.
Well, here were listed great deposits of gold and silver.
King Hussein closed the desert and said, go find the treasures. So exactly where you're standing here, there's a treasure. Hidden for more than 2,000 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls will be in Seattle for just 105 days. I'm Eric Shizky. We'll show you the scrolls before the exhibit even opens, coming up.
The Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition in Seattle has generated a huge amount of interest, with over 50,000 tickets sold before it's even opened. Today, the press are getting a sneak preview.
I think people expect that the scrolls are going to reveal something. They're going to unlock a code. They're going to bring a secret to light. And that sort of sense of expectation that we'll learn something about Jesus or something about Judaism in that era probably drives some of the interest.
What kind of world am I entering?
You'll meet some people who are making outlandish claims for them. So it's a world you'll have to tread lightly in, I would say.
So Jack, where do I start on this journey? Because it's exciting, but it's also complicated.
You need to go into Israel. You're going to need to go to some caves that are on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, where these scrolls were discovered.
Scrolls were actually found. Now the Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth. In just half an hour you drop 3,000 feet. And as you do so you can feel your ears popping, and also it becomes a lot hotter. years, this area has seen a number of changes, and not just because of conflict. This ruined building used to be a very popular seaside restaurant, but it lost its customers a long time ago, not because of war. You see, this seaside restaurant lost the sea. The Dead Sea is receding, is falling by about a meter a year, because both Israel and Jordan are using the river water which runs into it. Well, the route I've driven is from Jerusalem, which is somewhere over there, through these hills. I'm now about here, and the caves I'm looking for will be somewhere along the Dead Sea coast. These cliffs on the edge of the Dead Sea are not somewhere where you wander by yourself in the summer heat. So I've arranged to meet one of Israel's leading archaeologists to be my guide. Professor Hanan Eshel has been excavating in this area for the past decade. It's hard getting up there.
In the beginning of 1947, two Bedouins, Muhammad Adib and his uncle, they climbed up the cliff and they found this cave, and the cave was blocked with stones. And they threw a stone from this entrance, and they heard a noise like the stone hit jars.
I see.
Now they didn't have a flashlight, so they didn't know how much they will have to jump.
Right.
So they went down. The next morning, Muhammad Adib came by himself with a light. He crawled from the upper entrance and then
Squeezed into that little hole there.
right, and he jumped down,
Right.
which is not very high. And he jumped down,
Yeah.
and he told us that there were 8 jars lying here.
Right.
6 of them were empty, but in the last one there were 3 scrolls. 2 of them wrapped with textile, and 1 of them without textile. The 2 that were wrapped with textile are in perfect condition. Now, this was the first time the scrolls were ever found. It's where the whole story started.
Before 1947, the oldest known biblical manuscripts were from the medieval period. Cave 1 changed all that. Suddenly, scholars had texts 1,000 years older. There was 1 complete copy and 1 partial copy of the Book of Isaiah, a retelling of the Book of Genesis, a pesha or interpretation of the Old Testament book of Habakkuk, a literary style never seen before, plus other scrolls that seem to be the rules and practices of a radical and reclusive religious community led by the so-called Teacher of Righteousness. Muhammad's discoveries were not the oldest examples of writing to be found. Hundreds of hieroglyphs and clay texts had already been uncovered in Egypt and Babylon. But in the land of Israel, writing had been on fragile parchment and papyrus, so the fact that the scrolls had survived for 2,000 years was a shock to the academic community. The scrolls also raised intriguing questions. They were written at the time of Jesus. Could they tell us about the origins of early Christianity? Might other caves be hiding a lost gospel? In the years following the discovery of Cave 1, the prospect of such academic treasures led to a scroll rush as archaeologists competed with Bedouin in searching the cliffs by the Dead Sea. But it was an uneven contest. So why were the Bedouin more successful at finding the caves than the academics?
They knew the desert better, and they had more time. Meaning that the scholar would have come here for a period, for a season. And after they're done, they went back to East Jerusalem, and the Bedouins would stay here, and they had more time, and they would start to collect data from all people. So K4 was found by an old man who said that he remembered a bird flying into K4. Here it was only observation. They saw a bat flying out, and that's how they found Cave 11. This is the biggest cave where scrolls were found. There were here 30 scrolls, 4 of them in wonderful condition. But the most important scroll that was found here is the temple scroll. This is the longest scroll that we have.
Of all of them?
Of all of them. It's more than 8 meters.
And it's got a really strong smell in here.
This is the smell of the caves, and this is the smell of the scrolls. This is bat droppings.
Right, okay.
This is exactly what it is.
Yeah, so you'll always associate this smell with the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Probably, yes. This is the smell of the scrolls that I found, and this is the smell of the scrolls that other people found. Exactly.
Although the caves are celebrated today, I can't help but feel that there's something tragic about them. I suppose it's the thought that whoever placed the scrolls in the caves was never actually able to return and retrieve them. The wider public was slow to appreciate the full significance of this remarkable Dead Sea discovery, and for a good reason. The first the world heard about the scrolls was in a not entirely accurate article in the Times newspaper of April 12, 1948. The small article simply said, Yale University announces the discovery in Palestine of the earliest known manuscript of the book of Isaiah. It was found in the Syrian monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem, where it had been preserved in a scroll of parchment dating to about the 1st century BC. Now, this didn't attract a lot of attention, and that's not very surprising, given all the other news that was emerging from the Middle East at the same time. The scrolls were found against the backdrop of the violent last days of the British Mandate in Palestine. When the State of Israel was declared in 1948, it sparked war. Syria, Lebanon and Iraq invaded from the north without much success, but Jordan, which invaded from the east, succeeded in capturing this half of Jerusalem. The conflict slowed the discovery and trade in scrolls, but it didn't stop it. There was too much money to be made. It was a thriving business. Bedouin happy to do deals with an academic community eager to gather the scroll fragments into safe hands. In 1949, a ceasefire line was agreed which divided the city of Jerusalem. And if you wanted to cross from Arab East, controlled by Jordan, to Jewish West, controlled by Israel, you had to cross this line. And many of the scrolls in various states of decay made the journey across this road. Bedouin brought many scrolls here, to the École Biblique, the French Dominican archaeological school in East Jerusalem. Geyser Vermeersch, now a leading authority on the scrolls, came here as a young priest in 1952, eager to get his first glimpse of these remarkable documents.
It was a great exciting moment, and the one and only purpose in my life at that time.
Did you really see it that way, though? You really thought this is going to be the beginning of a lifetime's work?
Yes, although I got myself involved in many other subjects over the years, I used to say that was my first academic love affair, and I sort of remained faithful to that.
Gazer remembers well the haggling over the scrolls that took place between the Bedouin and the monks, led by the École's director, Father Roland Deveau.
I saw the Bedouin arriving one after the other, wanting to see Father Deveau, bringing more fragments for sale.
So tell me what that was like. I mean, here were a group of scholars and then some Bedouins coming in with...
Here came the Bedouin and pulled out from under their clothes a matchbox. And emptied the matchbox in which there were fragments. And when they realized that bigger fragments fetched a higher price, they tried to stick them together.
So there was haggling and negotiating.
Oh, yes. And this is how it went on for weeks and months.
The discovery of Cave 4 in 1952 changed the situation dramatically. The cave produced 15,000 fragments. Overwhelmed, Father Deveau appointed an international team to help assemble the scrolls. Located in the Rockefeller Museum in Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem, the team worked in a basement room that soon became known as the Scrollery.
Everything was deposited in the Rockefeller Museum. Let's imagine in a big box. And then they began to sort them out by examining the quality of the leather, the script, the thickness of the leather, determining this is manuscript A, this is manuscript B, this is manuscript C. And what they did then was to try to assemble their own individual jigsaw puzzles.
So what was the atmosphere like within that small group?
Electric, really. They were all frightfully excited. And at the beginning, they were working 25 hours a day.
But elementary mistakes were being made by Devau's team, mistakes that seem extraordinary to us now.
Of course, they didn't know how to handle the fragments. They were sticking them together with sellotape, which is, of course, totally unheard of nowadays. And people having the scrolls, and they were smoking their cigarettes.
So how did Deveau govern the group?
Well, he was the boss in every sense.
Right.
He chose the people, he told them what to do, and he told them what not to do. And the one thing, unfortunately, which he told them not to do was to allow other people access to the unpublished scrolls. The scrolls were considered as it were their propriety until they would release them fully examined, studied, translated, interpreted, and published.
For 6 years, the scholars managed to avoid the political turmoil around them as they recovered and then pieced together all the fragments. But when Roland Deveau decided to restrict the editing of the scrolls to a select few, then conflict entered their world. Some people are convinced that Deveau deliberately limited access because the Catholic Church wanted to suppress controversial passages in the scrolls. Author Michael Bagent backs the cover-up theory. When do you believe the Catholic Church first tried to control the information from the scrolls?
Initially, I don't think they took the scrolls seriously. They thought they were forgeries or irrelevant. But the penny really dropped for them when Professor Dupont-Sommet gave a lecture in Paris in the early 50s. And he drew very close parallels between Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly between Jesus and one of the prominent figures mentioned in the scrolls. And this clearly frightened the Vatican.
This prominent figure was the teacher of righteousness mentioned in the scrolls from Cave 1. It seemed to some of the early translators that the teacher of righteousness was a Messiah, and that he had been persecuted, tortured, and martyred. Michael Bajan believes that the Catholic Church felt that this challenged the uniqueness of Jesus.
At the heart of Christianity is this concept of Jesus and Christianity being unique. And what the scrolls suggested was that it wasn't unique at all. The Catholic Church has always had a department which controlled teaching and controlled the interpretation of archaeological discoveries. It's under the overall command of what used to be the Inquisition, but is now called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And this particular part got involved in the scrolls to make sure that nothing that was found in the scrolls would clash with Catholic doctrine and dogma.
DeVoe's team was a very large team. Surely, they all had their different interpretations of what they were coming across in the scroll.
The classic example was that of John Allegro, who certainly took his own line with the scrolls. Given that most of the team were Roman Catholic priests, and those who weren't were happy to toe the line by Catholic dogma, whereas John Allegro was an independent scholar, and so he very quickly ran foul of the rest of the team. But interestingly, he was the first to publish his material. So in effect, from my perspective, he was the best scholar there, but they destroyed him.
John Allegro is one of the most controversial figures in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1953, he came from England to join DeVoe's team, editing the thousands of fragments found in Cave 4. Allegro believed from the outset that their work should be shared with other scholars and the wider public. I met up with Allegro's daughter, Judy Brown, who explained how this approach brought him into conflict with his colleagues.
They were very much part of a small team, very excited about the work. They got in extraordinarily well, very sort of blokey atmosphere, but he was getting very worried about the way that DeVoe was handling the new stuff that came in, as you can see from the letter here.
This is a letter that he wrote.
That was in 1957. Yes,
but the affair is taking more sinister aspects. From the way the publication of the fragments is being planned, the non-Catholic members of the team are being removed as quickly as possible. Milik's section now totals nearly 200 plates, Starkey's nearly 100. Strugnell has about the same and is becoming a perfect little yes-man, for his money depends on DeVoe's good graces. He sounds angry and bitter there.
Yes, he was, and obviously I think that probably coloured his perceptions to some extent. It's certainly how he felt at the time.
By 1956, Allegro had also become frustrated at the slow progress of his colleagues in releasing their translations of the scrolls. Early that year, he made a radio broadcast for the BBC that questioned the uniqueness of Jesus. He claimed that the Cave 1 scrolls showed that the teacher of righteousness had been crucified. Although this translation has since been discredited, at the time it caused great controversy. Back in Jerusalem, Roland DeVoe was furious.
DeVoe realised that he'd lost control of John, I think, once he'd started talking to the press about his theories on the origins of Christianity and how the scrolls affected them. The rest of the team were by no means ready to talk about their wider significance. And John felt very much that because the rest of the team were ecclesiastical, most of them were Catholic, he felt that their outlook was not one conducive to opening things up to public access, whereas John felt that it deserved much wider discussion.
Undeterred, Allegro continued his broadcasting work, and in 1957 made a film for the BBC about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Now, the experts used to say that no really old documents would ever be found in Palestine. For one thing, they said it's too damp, and it's true that most of the country does enjoy a considerable rainfall. But there's one place the experts had overlooked.
To his intense annoyance, its transmission was repeatedly delayed.
He got extremely frustrated over the screening, as you can tell in that letter.
About the delays over it.
About the delays.
Yes, it says, well, dear Orny, who's the director of Jordanian Antiquities, well, they've done it again. For the 5th time, the BBC have put off showing that TV programme on the scrolls. I should not be at all surprised if the Vatican has not commanded its contacts in the BBC, where they are numerous and powerful, to keep it off the screens.
Let's look at these books. Literally hundreds of books have been written about the scrolls. As we publish more of our texts, the volume of scholarship applied to their problems is likely to increase. But perhaps only the future can tell what their ultimate effect will be on the religious beliefs of mankind.
It was eventually shown, but 2 years after it was made, and even then it was tucked away late at night. But there could have been a perfectly reasonable explanation for that. It seemed harmless enough, except for that rather barbed comment towards the end. But I can see how this combination of church establishment, ancient religious texts, and the length of time it took for information to emerge from this tightly knit group of scholars would lead people to imagine conspiracy theories everywhere. The Catholic Church, and indeed other Christian denominations, probably were wary about what might be found in the scrolls. But now they are fully published, and some exhibited here at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. Shrine is exactly the right word for this place, because the scrolls on display are treated with an almost sacred reverence. About 500 of the scrolls are copies of Jewish literature of the time. Another 200 are biblical, and a further 200 are the rules and practices of the desert community who probably hid the scrolls. Nothing in these documents has fundamentally undermined the Christian faith. The Vatican still stands. The scrolls do nevertheless overlap with the emergence of Christianity, and no one doubts that they could tell us a great deal about the religious and political atmosphere at the time. So I'm heading back into the desert, to a site that archaeologists believe holds the key to the question of who wrote the scrolls. This is Qumran, a ruined settlement a short distance from the caves where the scrolls were found. One of the first archaeologists to properly excavate the site was the director of the École Biblique, Roland Deveau. Initially, he dismissed it as a Roman fort, but as more caves were discovered in the 1950s, he turned his attention to the Qumran ruins. When he found a scroll jar buried in one of the rooms almost identical to those found in Cave 1, he knew he'd established a strong connection with the scrolls. Professor Jody Magnus is one of the foremost authorities on the site.
One of the things that connects the Dead Sea Scrolls with Qumran is the proximity of the site to the scroll caves. In fact, some of the caves are accessible only from within the site itself. Many scholars, including myself, identify this community with a group called by our ancient sources the Essenes. And the reason is our ancient sources, who include the Jewish historian Josephus, for example, describe a group with beliefs and practices that are very similar to what we read about in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, well, I want you to show me around the Archaeologists believe that the Essenes occupied this site from about 100 years BC, until it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 68 as they crushed the Jewish revolt. So what kind of people were they? During this period, the Essenes were one of a number of Jewish sects jostling for influence, believing only they understood the will of God. Their chief rivals were the Pharisees, and the priests who ran the Jerusalem temple, the Sadducees. According to the Gospels, both sects opposed much of Jesus' teaching. The members of the Qumran community were probably all men and numbered about 200. The Essenes called themselves the Sons of Light, God's chosen few, and had given up all their property and possessions for a desert life.
We're entering here a room at the southern end of the site, which is the largest room in the settlement.
Right.
And because it's the largest room, DeVoe identified it as an assembly hall. And because in the room next to it he found a pantry of dishes, he identified it also as a communal dining room. Now we know about the communal meals of the Essenes from Josephus, who describes each individual member being served his food on an individual plate. Now that sounds normal to us today, but in antiquity, typically when you banqueted, everyone shared out of common dishes. They were served individually because of the fear that ritual impurity could be transmitted through shared dishes and foods, which helps explain why so many dishes were found in the pantry next to us.
This obsession with purity stems from the fact that the Essenes believed that they'd built a desert alternative to the Jerusalem temple and that they were its priests. The scroll known as the Community Rules stresses that just as the Jerusalem priests had to be ritually pure, so did they. So the site at Qumran has 10 mikvaot, or ritual baths.
This ritual bath has low partitions running down the steps. The idea is that you are separating the impure from the pure. That is, you're walking down one side of the partition impure, immersing yourself in the water, and coming back on the other side of the partition purified.
See, and that's where I'm sitting here now, this line going down.
Exactly right.
So this idea of purity was what? I mean, a cleanliness issue? Or
it has nothing to do with cleanliness or hygiene in the modern sense of the word. Instead, we have certain categories of things which, if you come into contact with them, will render you ritually impure. And the categories of objects are things that seem to us today to be quite random. For example, ranging from mildew on the walls of houses to lizards to corpses. Now, if you came into contact with something like this, the way to purify yourself is to immerse yourself in a ritual bath. The idea of Jewish ritual purity is central to the lifestyle of this community.
In one of the largest rooms at the site, Roland DeVoe found what he believed to be the wreckage of mud brick tables and benches, possibly used by Essene scribes.
Now, the reason DeVoe identified this as a scriptorium is because mixed in with the debris, he also found inkwells. And the presence of inkwells is rare on archaeological sites in Israel, and so that suggested to DeVoe that the room must have been used as writing.
Was there anything, besides what you've described, that can tell us about the scrolls and the way they were written, or anything else about?
Well, our best evidence is the furniture itself. If you think about the preparation of scrolls, what are they doing? They're taking individual pieces of processed animal hide, parchment, and putting them together side by side to form a scroll. These long, narrow tables would be ideal for laying out the pieces of parchment. So I think that DeVoe was correct in identifying this as a scriptorium, and if that's true, then we can reasonably assume that some of the Dead Sea Scrolls might have been written or copied in this room.
I'm fascinated by these contemporaries of the early Christians and their quest for perfect holiness. I want to find out more about their beliefs and why they disappeared from history. So Jody and I head into the desert to meet up once more with Hanan Eshel. We rendezvous at the home of another community who believe that God has called them to a desert life, the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. George's. There are only 4 monks at this monastery, and whilst they're hospitable and they're friendly, they've come here for quiet and contemplation and prayer, so they're very shy of our television camera. The idea of withdrawing to the desert has lived on. We're in this monastery, for example. What is so special about the desert?
Judean desert was convenience for them because it was, in one way, isolated. They could live by themselves in an isolated place, and on the other hand, they were very close to Jerusalem. The community believed that their situation will change tomorrow morning. They're not going to be a marginal group, they're going to march back to Jerusalem. They were living one day walk from Jerusalem. They were ready to take their proper place in history.
But what was so wrong with Jerusalem that they wanted to sort of withdraw from it and into the desert?
According to my understanding, we're speaking about a group that was relatively young.
Really?
And yes, that was a teenager thing to go and say, I'm going to take God seriously. I'm going to think about God seriously. And I feel that the establishment, the temple, my parents, my priestly parents are not doing what they should do because they're ganking from the temple. They're making money out of the temple. And people who were really God-fearer, they felt that the right thing to do is to go away.
To young and rebellious. I mean, right. to put it in sort of common phrase.
Exactly.
By placing their scrolls in caves, this rebellious community ensured by accident that the manuscripts survived for 2,000 years. But why put them there in the first place?
Some of the scrolls could have been deposited in the caves, and I'm sure were deposited in the caves on the eve of the destruction by the Romans in the year 68 AD. But there were other caves which could have served, for example, as sort of libraries or archives of scrolls. It's possible that scrolls were being stored in caves over the course of time, so I don't think it's necessarily a case of all of them being hidden in caves.
I have an assumption, and the assumption is that since the site was destroyed and burned 3 times, in 31 BC, and then in 4 BC, and then in 68 AD, 3 times the site was destroyed, they understood that the way to protect their scrolls is to bring it into a cave. A cave is much safer. A cave cannot be burned.
The Essenes had been expecting trouble from the Roman army. They believed that they were living in the last days and were awaiting the arrival of the Messiah. This period would be a time of fierce battles. One of the manuscripts from Cave 1 was the so-called War Scroll. It describes a conflict between the powers of good and the Kittim, another name for the Romans. And it gives us a remarkable insight into Essene battle plans.
On the one hand, it actually describes real military formations, military equipment, battle tactics. On the other hand, there are all sorts of fantastic elements in it, such as having angels participate in the war alongside the soldiers. There was certainly a fight at Qumran. That is, something happened at Qumran. The site is destroyed, and we do have remains of military equipment in the destruction level, mostly arrowheads. So there was some fighting that occurred. Presumably some members of the community were killed at that point. Others may have fled.
For about 150 years, this inhospitable site by the Dead Sea had been home to the Essene community. That came to an end when the Roman legions arrived. Like earlier messianic rebels who got in the way of Rome, the Essenes met a violent end. Josephus tells us that they were tortured in order, he wrote, to induce them to blaspheme or to eat some forbidden thing. But they refused to yield, nor ever once did they cringe or shed a tear. Cheerfully they resigned their souls, confident that they would receive them back again. Qumran was never resettled, and the Essenes disappeared from the pages of history. The Essenes had been all but forgotten until the scrolls were discovered and Qumran was excavated. Suddenly, we knew about their beliefs and how the community was run. The Essenes had a voice. The more I hear about them, the more I want to see this legacy they left behind on parchment and papyrus. Very few of the Dead Sea Scrolls are on public display. Because of their fragile state, most are stored safely in Jerusalem, my next destination. This looks like a nondescript office corridor, but it's actually close to here that all 17,000 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept. Now obviously the Israeli Antiquity Authority doesn't want to give away their exact location, but we've been lucky because they're going to let us see a few special samples.
So this will be the first scroll that we'll show you.
Okay.
It's a beautiful piece from the Psalm scroll that was discovered in Cave 11.
That's quite exciting. This looks, on first reaction, looks amazingly well preserved. It doesn't look anything like 2,000 years old.
Yes.
It's amazingly neat as well. Very, very carefully.
It is. What you can see is, before starting to write, they would draw the lines.
Yeah, you can see quite clearly the lines.
And the letters, unlike what we're used to today, when we write on top of the line, if you look carefully, you'll see that the writing is hanging down from the line.
Right. The scroll features two alphabets, the square Hebrew script still used today and the older Paleo-Hebrew used when the scribe wrote the name of God to indicate the importance of the word and also that it shouldn't be pronounced.
So this is part of Psalm 119, and this is how it reads in Hebrew. Tuv ta'am v'dat lemdenu ki b'mitzvotecha hemanti. Teach me wisdom and knowledge, for in your commands I trust.
So how do you feel when you're able to, as you say, 2,000 years on, able to look at this scroll or any other fragments and read it?
Well, to me, this is what the scrolls are all about. And I'm a religious person, so to me, it's like, I open the Bible and I look at the scrolls and it's one and the same, and so I can feel the history.
Penina showed me a portion of the Book of Deuteronomy. 30 copies were found in the Qumran caves, making it amongst the most popular books of the community. It contains one of the most famous passages in the whole Hebrew Bible, the Ten Commandments.
Here it says, honor thy father and thy mother, kabed et abicha v'et imecha, leman yarichun yamecha, so that your life will lengthen.
For the conservators, the fascination with the scrolls lies less in the secrets they might unlock, and more in the fact that they represent a gift from the past, a gift to be treasured and preserved. One of the main tasks task for the laboratory is repairing the mistakes made by the scholars in the 1950s who were such fans of glue, glass plates, and the newly invented sellotape.
This is the sellotape that connects all of these fragments together. And as you can see, these are in a very acute state.
Well, you can barely see anything on
You can't see the writing anymore. The conservators go piece by piece, can turn around, and they undo the sellotape and whatever treatments that were done.
So it makes you sort of hold your breath when you're sort of even just turning that bit over.
I mean, we will work on every fragment, be it the most minute, because it might be in that fragment that the scholar is actually interested, or it's that fragment that will solve the puzzle.
Now, one of the challenges is that these scrolls survived for 2,000 years out in the deserts, in those caves. Question is, how do you make sure that they survive for another 2,000 years?
Okay, so the best for them would be to take them back and bury them in the caves.
Right.
But of course that's not going to happen, and therefore we monitored the caves. We monitored them summer, winter, day, night, and came to an average of what the best humidity is and what the best temperature is. And of course,
to recreate the conditions in the
what we tried to do was to recreate the conditions in the caves, and we keep them, as I said, in total darkness, and that's how they're kept.
Scholars are often unsure whether scroll fragments have been correctly joined together. Dr. Ira Rabin is analysing the ink of the scrolls. She believes each scribe made up his own unique ink, so by testing the composition of the ink on each fragment, she can prove once and for all if they are a correct match.
Here you have two fragments. They were put together and they are supposed to constitute one scroll.
Right.
Now, what we're still working to, we're trying to prove is that these two pieces belong to different scrolls, but the scrolls written in the same place.
But then, Ira, does that mean that the implications of this is that some fragments that have already been put together, once the ink analysis comes through and they're different, they'll have to be taken apart, if you see what I mean?
They have some suspicions that this might be not the case. It doesn't mean that I'm going to go through all the fragments. They are grouped in certain way.
Right.
But definitely this is the implication.
Ira's work on the ink could challenge established thinking about many scroll fragments and settle disputes about others. It's a very interesting area, so we agree that she'll get in contact when her ink tests begin. What I'm learning about the scrolls is that the story is always changing. Seeing the manuscripts has heightened my interest in the men who so skillfully wrote them. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written by scribes carefully copying from existing documents. I've been told that, amazingly, this tradition has survived to the present day amongst Orthodox Jews. So I've come to the village of Tal Shagar, a short drive from Jerusalem, to meet Yitzhak Cohen, the local rabbi and scribe. He's been commissioned to copy out a new Torah, the most sacred document in Judaism, as it contains the law of Moses. So Yitzhak, tell me if I'm disturbing you and you want me to
it's okay.
To concentrate.
It's okay. Yeah, I can't talk, but it's okay if you sit here.
Using his specially chosen turkey feather quill, Yitzhak is writing the last of the 5 books that make up the Torah, Deuteronomy. What are you writing on? Is it paper?
No, this is the skin of a baby cow, you can see.
Okay.
We taking the skin of the baby cow before he came to the world, actually.
So it would be inside its mother's womb.
Yeah, when they kill the mother to take the meat.
Right. Okay.
The idea is, first of all, it's a very good skin.
Very soft.
Yeah, and also he never saw something bad in the world.
I see. It'll take Yitzhak almost a year to complete the Torah. It's slow, methodical work, full of meaning and ritual. Before a scribe begins to write, he has to say a special prayer, dedicating his work to God. In a fascinating echo of Qumran, ritual purity also plays a part.
Some people used to go to mikveh, or
That's
before.
the ritual bath to cleanse yourself spiritually.
Yeah, and some of the writers go into the mikveh every time they're going to write the name of God.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
The first time I was writing Torah, I felt like I am piece of the big chain.
Really?
You understand what I mean?
I do know what you mean, yeah. In the modern world, the Torah could be printed, could be done by computer and bound so much more easily. Why the need to still write it out by hand?
Oh, that's a good question, and actually it's because of the reason that I have to think about what I'm doing, and if I will not think about the word I'm writing, so the Torah is not good, and we can't use it for a Torah. We can use it for a book in the bookshelf, but not for a Torah.
Sitting next to the rabbi, to me, felt as close as it is possible to come today to what it must have been like sitting next to the scroll writers at Qumran and other communities 2,000 years ago. This is about much more than beautiful calligraphy, because he believes himself to be at the end of a chain, as he called it, and that there is a weight of responsibility to get the Torah right and to hand it to another generation. And I've seen it again with people and the calligraphers writing Islamic texts as well.
When you're reading the Torah, to show respect, you're not turning your back to the Torah. You're going like this.
Go back this way. And then you turn. As soon as it was realized that the scroll library at Qumran and early Christianity overlapped, academics tried to make connections between the two. And who can blame them? The chance to learn more about Jesus and his followers was an intriguing prospect. Apart from the Roman historian Josephus, our main source of information about the early Christians is the New Testament itself. The more academics studied the scrolls and learned about the Essenes, the more some were reminded of a key New Testament figure, a man said in the Gospels to be Jesus' cousin. I'm driving from Israel and I'm headed towards the border with Jordan, and it's typical of the religious complexities and contradictions of the Middle East that I'm traveling to an Arab, largely Muslim country in order to see a Christian ceremony, a ceremony that's been practiced for over 2,000 years. But we're getting close to the border now, so we'd better stop filming.
الروح وما أصبحنا سكن الله الروح يجمعنا هللويا.
قراءة من رسالة القديس بولس الرسول إلى أهل رومية. أيها الأخوة، تجهلون أنه قد اعتمدنا في يسوع المسيح، إنما اعتمدنا في موته، فدانا معه بالمعمودية لنموت ونحيا حياة جديدة كما أقيم المسيح من بين الأموات بمجده الآب، فإذا اتحدنا به موتا بشبه موته كذلك تكون حالنا في قيامته. كلام الرب.
الشكر لك. لتحل يا رب ابنك الوحيد قوة الروح القدس على هذا الماء حتى يدفن الإنسان مع المسيح ويقوم.
I've been invited by the Sawalha family to watch the baptism of their daughter Tia on the banks of the River Jordan. With me is Professor Jim Charlesworth, who studied the scrolls for over 30 years and is fascinated by possible connections between the Essenes and early Christianity, and in particular, John the Baptist. Now, whether this is the exact location where John the Baptist performed his baptisms or not, many Christian families treat this place with a sense of reverence, and for them, there could be no better place to hold a baptism.
يا ماريا أنا أعمدك باسم الآب والابن والروح القدس. وين بشكير؟ معكم بشكير؟ يلا لبسوها، روح لبسوها هناك.
What is so significant about this ritual, this Christian ritual of baptism of this young child?
It's probably the oldest ritual, along with the celebration of the Last Supper, and it celebrates God's gift of acceptance that the human cannot achieve and cannot merit, because the human is born in sin, and we all sin, and we all know it. And so it's the Christian way of saying, thank you, God, for the gift of forgiveness.
الآن يمسح الكاهن الطفلة بزيت البيرون المقدس على قمة الرأس للدلالة بأن صارت أحلى. للدلالة بأنه هاي البنت صارت ابنة الله اللي أحبها وافتداها. إن الله القدير برب الإنسان.
At the site of Qumran, I mean, I saw the ritual bathing pools, and there is this idea that John was influenced by the Essenes and by Qumran. Is that where the idea of baptism comes from?
Well, a lot of scholars have thought that, and Qumran is just maybe, 4 hours walk from here. And there is a connection between what John is doing and what they were doing at Qumran. The flowing water is the most perfect water for a ritual bath, and that is what John the Baptist was doing. He was going where there was fresh, living water and baptizing people. Some scholars in the 50s said that Christian baptism began at Qumran. I don't think today a reputable scholar would make such a bland claim, but what we can see, they're forerunners or predecessors. I would say Christian baptism doesn't descend on earth from a flying saucer, but evolves out of different Jewish ideas.
Does it seem likely that John was himself part of the community at Qumran?
The singular most important link between John, who was baptizing here, and the Qumran community over there is the same interpretation of Isaiah 40 verse 3. A voice is calling in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. That's the way everybody has interpreted it. A voice in the wilderness is calling, prepare the way of the Lord. But both Qumran and John interpreted a different way. A voice is calling. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. That's what they heard, the voice calling. And that explains why they're here in the wilderness. They are literally living the scripture because they have felt the voice has called them to be in the wilderness.
Right, of course.
As far as we know, only John and the Qumran community are interpreting it this way. But we must not imagine that John the Baptist was an Essene or a Qumran.
Right.
Why? Because they believe that you have to be born a son of light. John the Baptist didn't think that. They are only for the elect, a very select few. So you have to see a difference.
Jim has a theory to account for Essene influence on John's life and teaching. The Gospel of Luke says that John's father was a temple priest, and so he may have headed to Qumran as one of Hanan Eshel's rebellious young people. But John's rebellion would only have gone so far. Jim believes that because Essene law states that new recruits must curse the sons of darkness, John would have refused.
We know that John the Baptist has a father, Zechariah, in the temple. He would be cursing his father, and he knew the commandments, honor thy father and mother. So at a certain point, he can't say amen and amen to this. So I am convinced that he was a member of the community and left it, or almost became a member of the community. When he heard this, he left it and went here and did many of the things we know from Qumran. God is coming. Judgment is coming. Now the axe is laid to the root of the tree. Repent. It sounds very much like Qumran, but it's John the Baptist.
Right. You present, a compelling case of how the Qumran community and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the whole idea of ritual, purity and water influenced John the Baptist. As a layperson, so what? I mean, what does it change, if anything?
It tells us that now we have a story that is not just pure legend and myth, but something really powerful happened. The story has history in it.
But could the Dead Sea Scrolls provide a similar context for the man John recognized as the chosen one, Jesus? Jim and I are heading back into Israel, to Jerusalem, along roads that Jesus would have known well, across the Jordan and through the Judean desert. There we meet up with Margan Broshi, an archaeologist and for 30 years the curator of the Scroll Museum, the Shrine of the Book. Scholars agree that it's very unlikely that Jesus ever went to Qumran. So what I want to know is whether he could have been influenced by Essene teachings.
They were absolutely right. He never went there. They were absolutely wrong. He didn't have to go there. We know from both Philo and Josephus, these great scholars at the beginning and the end of the 1st century, they say that there are 4,000 Essenes all over the land, and they're exactly where Jesus is teaching, outside the villages, outside the cities. So we have to presuppose probably Jesus could be influenced by them.
McGann, what do you think?
Jesus certainly did not belong to the Essenes. He couldn't have belonged to the Essenes. He wouldn't have accepted most of their teachings, but he was influenced by some of their teachings. The Essenes were very much in favor of poverty. They believed that rich is corrupt.
And that was unique.
This is an absolutely new idea, new and very difficult to follow. The rich corrupts, and if riches corrupts, you would rather be poor. This is exactly what Jesus preaches, that poverty is a value.
And this isn't the only evidence Margan believes of Jesus being influenced by the Essenes. Divorce was allowed in Jewish law, but Jesus spoke out against it.
The most important point about that is that he was using the same arguments as the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls used. I mean, the Lord has made them man and wife, so they cannot be separated.
One of the treasures from Cave 4 is a fragment of poetry. Its repeated use of the word blessed is very similar to the Beatitudes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew's Gospel. And yet the Qumran fragment predates Jesus by at least 50 years. For Jim Charlesworth, this is evidence that Jesus was using a traditional poetical form that his audience would have been familiar with.
He has to speak the language of the people, and he's influenced by what the people are influenced by. Certainly, the more we realize and the more we study about Judaism and that world, what we as children thought was unique. For example, only Jesus knew about Beatitudes, only Christians knew about the Messiah, only Christians knew about the Kingdom of God. None of these are Christian creations. They're coming from Judaism.
In the 1950s, when scholars were first translating the scrolls, John Allegro and others questioned Jesus' uniqueness. They saw the torture and death of the teacher of righteousness as a precursor to Jesus' death and execution. This caused a storm amongst Christians. the argument has now died away, with fresh translations of the scrolls challenging this version of the teacher of righteousness story. But it's a sign of how times have changed. Christians like Jim Charlesworth are now comfortable with the idea that Jesus was influenced by others in what he taught. This is because scholarship has moved on. Jesus is now seen in the context of his age and in particular the faith into which he was born. For Jim, this doesn't detract from Jesus' divinity.
Now we're becoming much more attuned to how very Jewish Jesus was. Very devout Jew. And that's the heart of Christianity.
I should say that it's very important for people willing to learn that both Christianity and Judaism have common grounds, even for daily life at our present time.
I'm beginning to realize that the whole story of the scrolls is like a series of puzzles set within a wider puzzle. And it is fascinating to hear the evidence of how John and Jesus may have been influenced by the Essenes. But I have one nagging concern. Just because Jesus and John shared similarities with the Essenes, does that automatically mean that they were connected? I sought out Geza Vermesh to get his perspective on the debate. Although he was one of the first academics to stress Jesus' Jewishness, Geza believes that it's too soon to reach firm conclusions on the extent of Essene influence on early Christianity.
All we know now is just the first superficial study of the documents.
Really? You think we've just scratched the surface?
Well, we have barely scratched the surface. We need really to gain depth in order to see what the real impact of these documents is. And by that time, we will have a much wider and much clearer understanding of what happened in Palestine 2,000 years ago.
Although, as Geza says, more time is needed, over the past 60 years the scrolls have already proved to be an amazing window into life in the 1st century, dramatically improving our knowledge of the period. But what of the texts that we can't read because of the effects of damp, old age and human error? Could they have more to tell us? For the moment, I must leave the Middle East. I've had an invitation to a laboratory on the other side of the world that's been described as a CSI for inscriptions. This is the University of Southern California, and its campus is a quiet oasis in downtown Los Angeles. And it's here that for over 20 years they've been working on the puzzle of the scrolls, revealing lost texts and piecing together long separated fragments. Since the 1950s, infrared photography has been used on the scrolls. But Professor Bruce Zuckerman has developed more precise infrared techniques to help scholars in their restoration work.
Now it's probably better to show you.
Sure,
this is one of these things that's easier to show than it is to.
That would be great.
So this is a fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll,
right.
and you know, it's just not a pretty picture.
It looks like burned bits of toast, to be honest.
Yeah. Now watch this. Presto changeo. And I pull up a matching infrared image of this.
Right.
And look,
my goodness,
the text just jumps out at you.
Yeah.
In fact, let's zero in on that, because one of the reasons I showed you this is that this is no ordinary text. The beginning of this text is Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is the beginning.
The first line,
right,
of Genesis.
Well, you know,
That's always
it's true. I can pick this up in a local Bible, but it's always nice to see that they were still reading it that way in the first century. So I'll show you, for example, another reconstruction that we did. Here is a plate that we were asked to study, and none of us, absolutely none of us, thought there was anything on this fragment. And we said, well, we should check. Besides, we have this new infrared technique. Let's see if it works. So when we did, we were able to suddenly see that there was real writing on it. I mean, we had dismissed this piece. You know, we used to call it the Dead Sea Schmutz, you know, which means the Dead Sea crap. Good Yiddish word, right? And then we discovered it wasn't so schmutty. It was the real deal. Now, the scribe who wrote this thing had a rather eccentric hand, and you notice, well, those letters are rather different. So it didn't take us long, actually it didn't take us very long at all, to notice that there was another ancient document, here it is, I'll put it up here, that in fact had those same handwriting characteristics. So we took the one piece that we just had and we dropped it into the picture like that.
I see.
And now the question is where to make it fit. So you play jigsaw puzzle games, you know. What do? You say, well, does it fit here? No, it doesn't fit there. Does it fit up here? No. But now watch this. It fits right there.
I see. You can see how that letter.
Yeah. The little word across here is the word Malkah, Aramaic, means king. Right. And this is from the book of Daniel.
Bruce uses a variety of techniques to restore lost texts. He showed me 2 fragments from the book of Job, where the scribe had scratched out a phrase, but hadn't written over it.
We asked ourselves, now why would the scribe cross something out and not write over it? In this case, he wrote it here, and then he wrote it again, and then he said, oh darn, and he scratched this one out, but he left the one which we no longer have, at least that's the theory, in here. That's why we don't see it. Nonetheless, because this is the book of Job, and because I know how Job goes, I know what phrase ought to go in here. The phrase in English is, and according to the way of a man. So what we did is we started to copy letters from elsewhere using the scribe's own hand and superimposing them over the spots. So, for example, here, this would be the and if you drop the letter in, it's not bad. Not only does it fit the space, but the traces also. The next part is the letter K, kaf, which would be according to, and that would go in there. And then you can just extend it according to the way of a man. I love to do this.
You clearly do.
Well, you know, it's like...
It's exciting.
It's puzzle games, but puzzle games with ancient texts, but every clue is important. And sometimes, I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes big issues of history turn on the proper interpretation of a single letter. And sometimes you can decide that point. You can say, that's the letter.
Before I left Bruce, I wanted to know what the next challenge was for him and his team.
I want to be able to look at a Dead Sea Scroll so that not only can we read the text, not only can we read the letters, but I could read the thicknesses of the inks as they cross each other. You might say, why would someone want to know about that? But the answer is because it tells you something about the craft of the scribes. And one of the issues that still is under debate is, where were the Dead Sea Scrolls written? Were they all written in one place? Were they mostly written in Jerusalem? Were they written in Qumran? If you have a wide variety of scribal practices, that by implication would seem to suggest that you've got scrolls coming from hither and yon.
Well, good luck.
Yeah,
thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
See you sometime again.
Hope so. Hello, Ira. How are you?
As I left the campus, I received a call I'd been waiting for.
A message to call you. Well, that was Ira Rabin on the phone from the Israel Antiquities Authority, who I met in Jerusalem earlier. And it seems that Bruce Zuckerman isn't the only person interested in the ink of the scrolls. And she was telling me that she's going to be in Berlin, where she's going to begin the ink analysis of the scrolls. And I want to see that, so it's on a plane to Berlin for me. Ira and her colleague Oliver Hahn start by introducing me to Bessie, the nickname for the electron accelerator that'll carry out the tests.
This is the electron storage ring.
Yes. Bessie produces highly accurate X-rays that will allow detailed analysis of the composition of the ink. Science that's usually deployed in industrial research is being used to solve a scroll's riddle.
It's a very powerful radiation, and all these people here can use this for completely different measurements.
Right.
But you need a very brilliant source,
right,
and you need there's a special kind of X-ray source for the measurements.
The fragments they'll be testing are those Ira showed me in Jerusalem. They were joined in 1959, but it's disputed whether they should have been placed together at all. The techniques she's using may also help answer the question that intrigued Bruce Zuckerman, whether the scrolls were written at Qumran or elsewhere. Yet the archaeological evidence that Jody Magnus showed me suggested the scrolls were made by the Dead Sea.
There is evidence that some scrolls were produced in this place. We're not trying to say that nothing was produced there, but the library is very big. It's huge. It's about 900 manuscripts. The question is whether all of these manuscripts were produced in this place.
Nice, okay.
Let's go.
Let's start. Get a ground level view of this amazing place. What do they say?
Well, actually I have a translation here.
This one here?
Yeah, you can just stir it.
I will teach you knowledge and wisdom and understand the ways of man and the works of the sons of man. Quite apt for what you're doing, isn't it? Oliver will scan each fragment separately. Bessie and her X-ray can detect particles of dust blown into the ink as the scribe worked, as well as trace elements in the water used to make the ink. Both give clues to the location where the scroll was written. Within a few minutes, the scroll gives up its secrets. The results begin to appear.
I think we can stop. So then we can look at the results. And what you can see here is there's the different element lines.
The chart shows the trace elements within the ink.
See, here is the calcium, the copper, zinc, the bromine.
I mean, I'm happy to have seen bromine. There is a lot of bromine in Dead Sea. I think it's the largest reservoir in the world of bromine. So I think this one could come from Qumran.
But the findings of the test on the second fragment proved to be problematic.
Well, we have all the same elements, yes, I guess, almost.
At first glance, when the results are compared, the graphs look similar, suggesting the fragments were correctly joined together by DeVoe's team. But Oliver spots an important difference.
But I think here is a discrepancy, because this little peak here is only the black line, but not the red one.
What can it be? Can it be that it's lead?
It could be, yes. But if it's lead, there's a difference between both things.
The difference is important, but after only one test cannot be conclusive. To determine if both fragments were written at Qumran and belong to the same scroll, further expensive investigations are necessary, and they must wait for another day.
Ira is philosophical and still believes that science can help academics solve Dead Sea Scroll puzzles. And she has one intriguing problem in mind.
There is a lot of interesting information or discussion about one very special scribe at Qumran who has written one QS, a very important scroll, and probably many other scrolls. He was probably a very important person, and I think either Bruce with his methods or me, we will get in the end whether it was one single person who penned a number of very important scrolls. And then it's also, like, there are even people who think that it was the teacher of Brightness himself who did it. And, well, I would not be able to say if it was him, but I think that, yes, I'm quite sure there will be a definite answer to this question.
You know, I was really hoping that for once a definitive answer was going to be given to one small aspect of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether these two tiny fragments actually belong to each other or not. But for decades, some of the most fundamental questions about the Dead Sea Scrolls have been shrouded in conjecture and debate. It's been full of what-ifs and maybes and possiblies. But being here in this amazing place, I get the sense that it is science's turn. That perhaps the next chapter in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls will be how science answers these fundamental questions.
The Qumran library contained many remarkable documents. A list of Essenes rebuked for breaking their laws, horoscopes, even a guide to interpreting the sound of thunder. But there's one scroll that promised not just academic treasure, but real treasure. This scroll was not written on parchment or papyrus, but copper. In 1952, in Cave 3, a very different scroll was found. Although broken in two, it was clear that it had some sort of inscription, but the copper was too brittle to unroll. One man thought he had a solution. John Allegro of the original editorial team. He'd guessed what it might contain.
Cutting through the engraved letters was sometimes unavoidable.
Allegro brought the copper scroll to the Manchester College of Technology to be opened in a risky operation.
The cut segment came away whole. The engraved letters gradually became visible, and I got to work on the text. And what exciting reading it made, for here were listed great deposits of gold and silver, in precious bars as well as sacred vessels.
Allegro was ecstatic. It was the start of an obsession that would last for many years. I flew to Amman in Jordan, which has been home to the copper scroll for the past 50 years. With me came Judy Brown, who has never seen the open scroll that so fascinated her father.
Here it is.
It's wonderful, isn't it? Amazing. Some of the lettering is quite clear even to somebody who knows nothing about it. And I know he didn't think the person who did it was very skilled at it or not used to it, but he thought the lettering was shaped incredibly carefully. Glad to see them, glad that they're still there as well. I think those are a lasting memorial, aren't they?
I travelled back to Qumran and to Cave 3, where the copper scroll was discovered. Once again, my guide was Hanan Eshel.
Right here, this is where the copper scroll was found.
The scroll listed 64 hiding places in Jerusalem and around Palestine where gold and silver and temple offerings were hidden. Allegro reckoned that the total weight of the precious metal was 26 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver.
Now, the reason why John Allegro believed those treasures existed was that because it was so precise, the description, when the trail leading to Ilkanya is crossing the aqueduct, look north, you'll see
so it sounded like clues to a treasure hunt. Or
it looks very precise. Yeah. So, writing on copper, which was expensive, and having a very detailed description, on the other hand, made Allegro believes that those treasures exist. Yeah. So King Hussein closed the desert and asked John Allegro, go find the treasures.
In 1960, using the inscriptions on the scroll as a guide, Allegro began a number of excavations around the Dead Sea, but found nothing. However, his hope was that the Kidron Valley between Jerusalem's walls and the Mount of Olives would be the hiding place of buried treasure. Hanan took me to one of the monuments in the valley, the Tomb of Absalom, where the copper scroll claims that treasure is buried.
Actually, it's much bigger than I imagined it was going to be.
The whole area just west of the tomb was covered at that time with soil. This area, you couldn't see the steps. All this was covered. And in the copper scroll it says, under the tomb of Avshalom, from the western side, you have to dig down 12 cubits and you'll find 80 talents of silver. So exactly where you're standing here, Allegro believed that there is a treasure.
Because it said it directly in the scrolls.
Right. And he went down and he hit bedrock. This is bedrock. There was nothing here. You couldn't continue going down.
So what were the different ideas and theories of what the treasure was?
Some people believe that the treasures are coming from the Temple Mount, so those are the treasures of the temple, and it have to do with the money that was brought to the temple, and that's why there is this enormous amount of silver and gold in the copper scroll. And there were other people who believed that this is the treasure of the group who lived in Qumran, because we know from the scrolls that the group was rich. The people, the member, didn't have anything, but the group as a group was very rich. The point of people like me that don't believe that the treasure exists, they said that the amount of silver and gold is so enormous that it's impossible that anybody had in Second Temple period so much silver and gold. I mean, when you read the copper scroll and you see how precise he is, it seems to me that the reason why he's so precise is to convince his readers that the treasure do exist. And he did a wonderful job.
The list of treasures in the copper scroll has had a powerful effect. Over the years, it has inspired 8 expeditions which have all failed to find anything. The prospect of hidden riches seems to turn academics into treasure hunters. Hanan told me a story that perfectly illustrates this.
While Allegro was digging, one of his volunteers got lost. He took a walk and he didn't find his way back. And he spent the night with the Bedouins. And the Bedouins who brought him into their tent showed him some documents that they still had in 1961. And they showed it to the student. The student couldn't distinguish, was it Greek, was it Hebrew, was it Aramaic? But he came back to Allegro and told him, I got lost and the Bedouins had took me in and they showed me some documents. And Allegro continued to excavate.
He was more concerned with finding the treasure.
Right. I would have stopped my excavation and I would put all my energy to locate this Bedouin. He still had, 9 years later, he still had some fragments in his tent. Today, people would act totally different. The treasure are not going anywhere. The Bedouins are moving.
It seems to me that the story of the copper scroll encapsulates that of the scrolls as a whole. Just as John Allegro hoped that this 2,000-year-old inventory would lead him to buried treasure, so the world of the scrolls is full of people projecting their own hopes onto these ancient documents. Conspiracy theorists have looked for sensational cover-ups. Christians for evidence to reinforce the Gospels. Skeptics, evidence to debunk them. Even Muhammad Adib, who started it all, was hoping the scroll jars would contain silver and gold. It's my last night in Jerusalem, and I've been invited to head out to the suburbs to take part in a unique celebration, which has at its heart a sacred scroll. The owner of this house has paid for a new Torah scroll to be made for the local synagogue. The neighborhood have turned out to watch as the scribe copies out the final 12 letters, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. To raise money for the synagogue, each letter is auctioned. The highest bidder wins the privilege of holding the scribe's arm as he writes the letter. The Torah's now complete, and it's a celebration that needs to be shared with the rest of the community.
It's impossible to know whether each time a Dead Sea Scroll was finished, whether there were celebrations such as this. But given the austerity of the Essenes, it's fair to assume that they certainly wouldn't have been as exuberant. But what this ceremony shows is a reverence for the written word.
Watching the celebrations, I realized that the true Dead Sea Scroll treasure is the scrolls themselves. For this community, it's the preciousness of the Word of God they celebrate, not what they hope will be in it. The very survival and preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls after 2,000 years is a miracle. It's a unique and compelling library, wherever it was written and for whatever reason. I believe that the scrolls of the Essenes will continue to remain elusive, perhaps never completely losing their description as a puzzle.
The Essenes didn't survive the first century. They pretty much disappeared from history. It took a Bedouin looking for his goat 2,000 years later to change all that. And now their rules, their prayers, their beliefs and their hymns are being studied by a new community of academics around the world. And so the Essenes live on, and they'll continue to do so, because the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is very far from being over. The last word is yet to be written.
On a mission to persuade the nation to fly back in the 1920s. That's next tonight. BBC4 delves into the archives to find an inspiring story captured on film.